We continue the Desert Fathers, translations by Helen Waddell, with the life of St. Paul, the first hermit, by St. Jerome. There is a variant reading in some of the manuscripts which suggests that the Vita Pauli was written during Jerome's own years in the desert, before he found his vocation. He had his boyhood in Dalmatia, his learning and a young man's pleasures, and the beginning of his book collecting in Rome. Had gone a scholar's journey to Treves, copying manuscripts, made some of the friendships of his life at Aquileia, and finally broke away to wander in what he called an uncertain pilgrimage through Greece and Anatolia. The blazing heat in Cilicia struck him down, and he headed through Syria to find safe harbor for my wreck in Antioch, where his friend Evagrius seems to have preceded him. For Evagrius, the journey from Italy was a homecoming, for he had great wealth and a country house at Morania, about 28 miles south of Antioch. For Jerome, it was the first stage of the pilgrimage that was literally to end in the coming of the fourth of the wise men to Bethlehem, with his ambiguous gifts of exquisite scholarship and a bitter tongue. Meantime, he was not yet 30, and passionate for Cicero. The country house at Morania was agreeable. Evagrius, a generous patron there, was always someone at hand to copy a manuscript, and there were 3 friends, Innocent, Hylas, Heliodorus, as delightful as their names. But the desert was too near the town for the peace of mind of a sensitive young man. Now, people mean different things when they mean sensitive. Some people mean autism or, other physically based things. Some people mean, like, for example, white people getting sunburned more, or people with blonde or red hair being a little bit more sensitive to the touch, or something like that. Other people mean it as an insult. Oh, you're sensitive. Well, if you're aware and compassionate and stuff, nothing wrong with that. Just don't be a social justice warrior. Malchus, innocent and old, was to be seen at church every day, with his epic years of desert sanctity behind him. Theodosius of Rossus, a hermit so austere and so kind that the sailors on those coasts abandoned their familiar deities, or so they thought they were deities, in any serious peril to cry on Theodosius's god, was a dangerous correspondent. Evagrius himself was either working on, or had already finished, his translation of the life of St. Antony, in itself enough to kindle a passion for the absolute that not even Cicero's suavity could assuage. And then Innocent died, and after him Hylas. By 375 of the Common Era, Jerome was solitary in the desert of Chalcis, and what he suffered there he told years after to his girl pupil Eustochium, with the regret of appeased middle age for the exaltation and misery of youth. Now, yeah, some people look back and, they tried to indulge and think, or maybe they didn't try to indulge, and then they say, well, I had no idea that was going to be the best time of my life. I would have tried to enjoy it more, or tried to, not judged it as it was, right? But yeah, hedonism is paying attention to the consequences. It's not this mindless debauchery that people attribute to it. But if you don't have a touch of hedonism or something like that, you're going to cause yourself probably more misery than the joy that you pursue. Especially nowadays, certain diseases and stuff are more common. Drugs are more adulterated. There's chemicals that you're exposed to that you don't want to mix with these things, and all sorts of, and the loud volume that can damage your hearing and be hard on you otherwise. That's more common. And transformed food and all that. But oh, how many times did I set in the desert, in that vast solitude, parched with the fires of the sun, that offers a dread abiding to the monk? How often did I think myself back in the old Roman enchantments? There I sat solitary, full of bitterness. My disfigured limbs shuddered away from the sackcloth. My dirty skin was taking on the hue of Ethiopian's flesh. Every day tears, every day sighing, and if in spite of my struggles sleep would tower over and sink upon me, my battered body ached on the naked earth. Of food and drink I say nothing, since even a sick monk uses only cold water, and to take anything cooked is wanton luxury. Don't do self-abuses if it's not necessary, and and it doesn't help anybody out. You're not being charitable by wearing, oh, I have to take a cold bath just to take a cold bath. There's stimulus things about that, but Yet that same I, who for fear of hell contented myself to such a prison, I, the comrade of scorpions and wild beasts, was there, watching the maidens and their dances, my face haggard with fasting, my mind burnt with desire in my frigid body, and the fires of Leicester alone leaped before a man prematurely dead. In the Islamic tradition, there's a difference here, is that one of the things that Jesus, let's just use the Christian term for four people, but we're not talking about four people in the Islamic tradition. You're supposed to do stuff like, care for your hair, maybe oil your lips or something to obscure the fact that you're fasting, or at least not to make it self-mortification, right? So the destitute of all aid, I used to lie at the feet of Christ, watering them with my tears and wiping them with my hair, struggling to subdue my rebellious flesh with 7 days fasting. Why not just turn your flesh towards doing good, right? I do not blush to confess the misery of my hapless days. Rather, could I weep that I am not what I was once. I remember crying out till day became one with night, nor ceasing to beat my breast until my Lord would chide and tranquility return. So sort of an S&M moment of relief, right? I grew to dread even my cell with its knowledge of my imaginings, and grim and angry with myself, was set out solitary to explore the desert, and wherever I would spy the depth of a valley, or a mountainside, or a precipitous rock, there was my place of prayer. There, the torture house of my unhappy flesh, and the Lord himself as witness, after many tears and eyes that clung to heaven, I would sometimes seem to myself to be one with the angelic hosts. He left the desert after 5 years, and though he was afterwards to cry, then the desert held me. Would that it had never let me go. It is to be remembered that Jerome was a Virgilian romantic, even in the life of the first hermit, Antony, who distrusted literature. Is tripped up by a quotation from the Aeneid at every step. I toiled hard, said Jerome ruefully, to deject my style, but however it comes, you may fill a jar with water, and it still will smell of the wine that steeped it first. For Jerome's books went with him to the desert. For many a year had I cut myself off from home and parents and sister and kin, But what is harder than these? The habit of exquisite dining. But the library I had built up with such ardor and pains in Rome, I could not bring myself to do without. The solitude of the desert drove him, not to silence, but to the mastering of another language. No fasting could tame the intolerable energy of his imagination. He must have something craggy to break his mind upon, and he found it in Hebrew, which is not quite the same thing as Aramea, in which the biblical texts are written in, and Jesus encountered. It was literally Aramea for 2,000 years, and then, when it became the language of the rabbis, Hebrew, and then there's changes to the effect that a quarter of the words in Tanakh don't really have a literal meaning. Some of the words are flipped on its head. They don't remember Aramea as a living language as such. And some of the words are flipped on their head and all that stuff. When I was a young man, he wrote to his friend Rusticus, and the solitude of the desert walled me in. I cannot endure the stinging of my lusts, the heat of my nature. The flesh I might try to break with frequent fasting, but my mind was seething with imagination. So to tame it, I gave myself up for training to one of the brethren, a Hebrew who had come to the faith. And so, after the subtlety of Quintilian, the flowing river of Cicero, the gravity of Fronto, and the gentleness of Pliny, I began to learn another alphabet and meditate on words that hissed and words that gasped. What toil I spent, what difficulty I endured, how many times despaired and threw it up, how many times contemptuously returned to begin anew. My own consciousness is witness that endured it, and those that lived their life beside me, and I thank God that out of that bitter seed of letters I plucked so sweet a fruit. Christendom had still more reason to thank God. The final vintage was to be the Vulgate translation of the Old Testament, as they were going to call it. He was still working on Hebrew in his old age. Meantime, however, the sufferings of an Italianate body in the Syrian desert, combined with the internecine warfare of the three bishops of Antioch over the three hypostases of the Trinity, to drive him back, first to Constantinople, and then to the adamant security of St. Peter's See, and the familiar lyrical enchantment of Rome. The wise Pope Damascus had divined where his genius lay, and set him to his masterwork of translation, first from the Greek, recension after recension, and the rich amenities of scholarly controversy were to keep him happy till he died. But when he made the bibliography of his own books for the catalogue of illustrious men, the Vita St. Pauli came first in the list. And when after a long silence he began to write again in Bethlehem, it was the story of Malchus of the desert that he had heard from him a lifetime before in the good days at Maronia. This is the story of Malchus, that was an old man, told to me, that was a young one. And this I tell you now that I am old, and do ye tell it to those that come after you, how amid swords and deserts and wild beasts chastity was never captive, and how a man devoted to Christ might die but cannot be defeated. And one of the things that we look at there, right? There's not really any quotes with that part. Yeah. Oh, wait. Page 28, we have Tunc me tenebat eramas et utinam pertinuiset ad Pamachium Epistle 66:13. But I would like to say that the definition of chastity really tends away from celibacy to just keeping it in marriage. And it extends to more than that sort of thing. And now I didn't know my 2000 21 ceremony there still has its remnants.